Howdy, everybody. Welcome back to Keychains. I'm Steve.
And I'm Ryan.
So, last week was actually not too terrible in terms of actually playing Keyforge.
No, not at all.
Still wasn't a tournament, but we actually had 5 whole people to play with.
5 entire living people full of goo.
Yeah. Whoa. Gross.
Life goo. The goo of life.
Nope.
Blood. That's what you guys call it. I mean,
God.
that's what we humans call it.
Oh, God. Hang on. So it was a good day last Tuesday. We actually sold them out of Keyforge decks again. I think between you, me, and our friend Brian.
Yes, we did.
We
finally
bought like everything they had.
It was like the last vestige of Keyforge availability in the half hour in any direction. It seems.
Yeah, and for once, I actually got a deck that had Logos in it.
I know.
Still managed to have Untamed in the deck as well.
Yep. So it's funny. I don't have a single Brobnar deck because I never got the starter, so I don't even have that one.
Yeah, that's fair.
And I
have.
Go ahead.
No, I was just saying I have 4.
Dang.
4?
That's ridiculous.
4. Yep.
It's funny because Brobnar is such an aggressively arted faction. Like the art and everything, they seem very fighting and very aggressive, and they seem very combat oriented, which is great. But without a concept of true aggro, like you're not attacking a life total. So really, it tickles me that that the Brobnar, which are this aggressive aggro-y kind of faction house, are really more of a control element, because by eliminating your opponent's creatures, you're controlling their ability to reap and get ember and everything. So it's amusing to me that the aggressive looking faction, the aggressive acting faction, is really a control faction.
Yeah, it's way more tempo than I even thought of. It ends up being one of those factions where it's fun to like. It actually rewards you for not reaping.
Yeah,
I mean there are some reap creatures. I think I'm not even going to commit to. Yeah, like the Kelpie Dragon and things like that have a reap ability, but yeah, like they just reward you for fighting, and
yeah.
it makes things so much more interesting. Like anytime I go up against a Brobnar deck, I have to think about what creatures I'm going to put on the table, because they're probably not going to stay.
Yeah, absolutely. There's times where it seems relevant to just, declare that house. I know we've said faction 6 times. That's my fault. I kind of got that in your brain. But there's times where it's where it's acceptable to just be like, I'm just gonna declare this house, discard the creatures, and hope to draw into something that's more relevant than the creatures. And probably not a tremendous amount of the time, because at least if you put the creature on the table, they still have to run into it. But having damaged creatures on Brobnar's side helps them, so it's not impossible that there's situations where you just don't want creatures on the table against them, depending on their board state.
Yeah, you actually just brought up an interesting point to me too. I was listening to I think it was the Wild Wormhole podcast, and they were talking about how they don't like Bad Penny because Bad Penny just clogs up your hand, which I definitely agree with. But I think honestly, I would just discard her if you're having that many issues with her being in your hand. I mean, it does feel good to keep playing her over and over again, so that could be the kind of like the reason why you think like, oh, I need to keep playing her. But I learned that issue too of like, oh, if I keep playing her, she's gonna keep dying, and then I'm gonna keep losing her, and then she's just gonna come back to my hand, and now my hand's just getting more clogged up. So I don't know. It was an interesting. I had not thought of it the way that they had pitched it, and so that made it definitely interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, that if you, she's constantly clogging it around like that. I've never been in a situation where Bad Penny has been used to my detriment in that way. But I have been in situations where there's a Logos card. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, where when he's destroyed, he goes to the top of your deck. It's kind of the same thing, sort of. And that that like is really irritating because I keep drawing the guy and I'm like, in that particular deck, the Logos isn't a tremendously strong house, so I'm less incentivized to call that house. So I just keep getting this guy stuck in my hand, and I can't discard him and I can't play him unless I call Logos. And then, but Bad Penny, and maybe I'm just lucky that any deck I have a Bad Penny in, the Shadow House is solid. I've never really had a bad experience with Penny, but it's still like, that's not to detract from their argument. That makes perfect sense to kind of be disincentivized to play her out because she gets clogged back into your hand.
Yeah, and you finally got another time traveler deck. So that's what, 3 now?
So I don't. So I miss in the show notes. I miswrote that. I thought it was a time traveler deck, but it's not. It is a. Or no, that's right. I did get a third one. I'm sorry. The one I was thinking of, Diesel, is not. But the other one is Cicero, Berg, Wise Woman. Yeah, that one has help from future self, library access, time traveler, obviously. Rocket boots is pretty sweet. So, and that one's pretty sweet.
So a note, Ryan, you always get help from future self if you get time traveler.
I know, but alphabet, like the way the card, that was the first one. Yeah, I pulled it up on my phone. So that's actually something I don't know if everyone is aware of, that I stumbled across recently, and I think it was on the Reddit. So I apologize, I can't give credit to. No, it was listening to the Wild Wormhole podcast. They mentioned reading an Archon card. It is in. It's in order by the card type and then alphabetical. So when you're looking at an Archon card, the actions appear first, then the artifacts, then the creatures, then the upgrades at the very end. So if you're trying to look at someone's Archon card or your own Archon card and just get an idea of like, well, what am I dealing with here? You can kind of pretty easily scan through, and even if you don't recognize what a card does, you can see where it appears in terms of card type, alphabetically. By card type, you can kind of see like, oh, that's an artifact, or oh, that's an upgrade. Okay, so I know I need to worry about this type of thing or that type of thing with it. It was a cool little trick that I didn't even realize until they mentioned it. And now I can't not see it.
Yeah, that's pretty cool to know. I actually didn't realize that. I probably listened to that podcast too, and I totally missed it.
Yeah, that's fun. I mean, I don't expect people to memorize everything we talk about, on the first listen. But by the time they've listened to us, the same episode of ours 4 times, because I assume our episodes are going to be so amazing that they're going to want to listen to them 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 times. Probably by like time 4, they've got most of the general topics memorized.
I don't know if we're that popular, Ryan.
Well, I mean, all it takes is one listen to, and then you're hooked because we have the audio version of, morphine in our sonorous voices.
I'm sick, so I don't know if my voice is so sonorous.
Wouldn't it might even be more sonorous, Steve. It might be for the good of humanity that we shouldn't have recorded this podcast while you were sick.
You mean the other way around?
Your dulcet tones. All right. Actually, I think dulcet is the opposite.
So FFG finally released their details about how chain-bound events are going to work, and that's interesting.
Very.
So
in a good way.
Yeah. I'm actually pretty excited about it. I finally learned how to get the app so we can actually track chain-bound events. So I just need to talk to the people at our local game store to actually get it downloaded. Looks like it will require a webcam though, so I'll have to pack that with me and just have to work with them.
A webcam?
Yeah, because you have to. So you have to register each deck.
Well, don't you just need a phone camera would work for that?
No, so it's a PC app.
So they, at our particular local game store, they have a phone attached to their, or no, I'm sorry, they have their own phone and they scan. Yeah, so it's a PC app. So you're right. I'm sorry.
I believe it's a PC app at least. Based on what I can see from the FFG forums, it seems like that is the case.
It'd be interesting if they released it as like a mobile app.
That'd be much easier.
Right.
But it's still something that's like bound to the local game store. So I don't know how that works for if they have a community member who does all the running of events. So I'm just going to end up talking to them So we're gonna actually run a chain-bound event next Tuesday. So that'll be fun. Finally get to see some decks chained up. I wanted to actually look this up really quickly. It looks like right now, since the chain-bound event has gone live, the deck with the most chains is 4.
Yep.
And the one that actually appears on the top here is I saw someone post this one in the Reddit. It is Cameron, airport musician. So that's pretty good. It does look like it's a pretty good deck, but
I glanced at that one too. It looked pretty solid.
Yeah, it was pretty funny. But so the deal is that you're gonna play in a chain-bound event, and depending on your wins and losses and the size of the event determines how many chains you get for each set of wins you get. So, and then after that, the number of chains you accumulate increases the power level of your deck. So once you hit one chain, your deck is currently like officially 1 power level. Then 7 through 12 gets you at power level 2. 13 through 18 brings you to power level 3. And then 19 to 24 brings you to power level 4. So the thing I was thinking about this, because a lot of people are questioning whether it's possible to get past level 4.
Well, what I'm wondering, is this lifetime chains or is this concurrent chains? Like if I get, 7 chains, and then I lose a bunch of games and go back down to 0 chains, does that mean that my deck is now power level 0, or does it stay at power level 2 because it at one point had 7 chains? And then if I gain 3 more chains, does that mean it's or I guess if I gain 6 more chains over the course of a couple new tournaments, having dropped to 0, does that put me into power level 3, or does that mean that I'm still power level 1 at that point?
Yeah.
How do the chains cumulatively work or not work?
Yeah,
I'm not sure. I didn't see that in the article, but I might have just overlooked it.
Yeah, it's possible. I've seen a lot of people talking about it, and they haven't really figured it out either. So I don't think you and I are kind of in the woods here, and everyone else is just has that knowledge. But so what it looks like is how you accumulate chains is if you go to any event with 4 to 8 players, which will be just a 3-round event. If you win all 3 games, you get 3 chains. Then if you win 2 of your games, you get 2 chains, and then 1 or 0 wins means you subtract a chain from your deck. So that's how you're going to lose chains over time. Any event bigger than that will be a 4-round event, with 4 wins being 4 chains, 3 wins being 2. The only real difference between the other two is that if you get 2 wins, your chains don't change at all. So if you win 2 and you had 4 chains going into it, you're gonna leave with 4 chains. Then it goes back to 1 or 0 wins, subtracting 1.
So there's some interesting meta gaming that can happen with this. Just kind of thinking of what people could do with it. So you go to a 8-player tournament, let's say, and you win your first game, but it's by the skin of your teeth, and you've kind of looked around and you know that everyone's decks are like way better than yours. Is it even worth trying to get a second win, knowing that you have no chance of placing well in the tournament? And getting 2 chains as a result? Or is it better to just drop right then and there with 1 win, and that way you don't get any chains or lose any chains you might have had? Like if you don't think your deck if you don't think your deck stacks up well against the rest of the people playing that day, it almost seems like you don't want to go past 1 win if you have no chance of winning, which kind of feels bad. But likewise, if you go to a tournament and you win, you get again, we'll go 8-player 3-round tournament, and you win, you get your 3 chains. Is it worth it? And I guess you have to look at the prize support. So you would have to then, to remove those 3 chains, you would have to go to 3 events, pay let's usually it's about $5 for these things to get into an 8-player, well, to get into just a casual chain bound event. I imagine it's probably about $5 entry. So you would pay $5 for the one that you won, and then you'd have to enter 3 more times to remove your chains if you just basically entered and dropped immediately. So you'd have to spend $20. So you'd want to profit off of your one win there. You'd want to make more than $20 to make that worthwhile as an effort. Something to keep in mind. It's really metagaming, and like I don't think people are going to be sitting there signing up for tournaments and then immediately dropping just to clear their chains. It seems like a huge waste of money. I can't imagine an 8-player tournament is going to have a prize pool that's more than $20 for the winner, but I could be wrong.
I mean, those play mats.
But it's
just
something to kind of keep in mind. What's that?
Those play mats are $20.
So there you go. I mean, I guess you win one, get your playmat, and then you just pay $15 over the next 3 weeks or the next 3 tournaments to clear your chains.
Yeah,
is that worth it?
I don't think it's worth it. And honestly, I think the thing that will kind of come of this is you're either not going to play that deck, you're going to show up with something different, or you're going to want to see how, like, I feel like metagaming your deck seems like a waste of money in a way. And
yeah,
and even if you're not going to stack up, like, you're still going to get that power level, right? Like that power level change. So it just seems to make more sense to keep going and not worry about it. Like, and then on top of that, you'd be pleasantly surprised about like what you run in, like you encounter. You could win a game and just because of a misplay or whatever.
Yep. So people could just draw bad cards at the wrong time for them.
Unless you have library access, but
yeah, I mean, or if you have Restringitus and they manage to get an entire hand of Sanctum and no way to remove it. Poor Harry.
No, that was not a great time for him. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this kind of go. We'll probably find out next week. But and then I guess FFG also pushed out some new app updates, which were none of the things I was hoping for on the app itself.
No, I mean they added favorites. I feel like I think I saw that favorites were in there previously, but maybe they just tweaked it. Like I think I could assign a deck as a favorite in the app before. Maybe the thing that they added was the ability to filter by favorites. But I swear that I had the ability to do favorites before this past Tuesday.
I can't remember. I think you could see what you had favorited on the website, because the thing is you always see what happens in the website before it comes out in the app. So right. I think what probably happened is you could see the favorites, but you couldn't assign a favorite on the app. But I feel like I had assigned some favorites to some decks that I had in the app while we were playing games, but I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, we don't have a Wayback Machine to go and check.
We could sometime.
The other
Help from Future Self.
Yeah, there we go. The other app update was deck notes. You can now go into a deck and there'll be a little note box at the bottom of the deck where you can put notes in the deck, which is kind of neat. You can, say like, oh, this is more of a controlling deck, or remember this card, or this is I don't know. I can't think of an amazing reason to use it necessarily. I think it's still cool. I think people will use it. Just personally can't think of why I might.
Yeah, it turns out that I'm the worst kind of millennial, and it is literally the millennials who were born before like 1990. Because like I hate typing on a phone. Like it's the worst experience. I've tried everything. I've tried swipe typing. I've tried like T9 back when that was a thing on phones. I just hate it. So I usually will bring up, I'll try to remember notes about my decks as I go along, and then I'll just type them in, through the notes on the website. And honestly, a lot of my games end up being through the Crucible anyway, so I generally have the deck that I'm playing pulled up on the Master Vault while I'm playing on the Crucible, just so I can because I've been tracking my wins and losses that way. So
makes sense.
Yeah.
How are your wins and losses doing with your most played deck? What's your record right now?
I think it's 50%. I
That's
think my
good.
most played deck is. It's gonna be. Nope, that's definitely not it. My most played deck is He Who Manufactures Spirits, and I have 8 plays with
Okay,
that. I have 4 wins, 4 losses.
nice.
And but I do have a new deck that is Brobnar Shadows Untamed that has 2 wins under it, and I'm do really like that. And that deck is, this is gonna suck to say out loud, and I'm not gonna spell it out loud. So if you can guess it, or you can just easily just search by one of the words and find it. So the deck is F Falconson, Mine Runs Swift Scavenger, and that seems to be doing all right. It has a lot of controlly bits to it, which I mean, just Brobnar, as we said at the top here, like Brobnar is just brutal in terms of managing the board. It also has a Khalifi dragon in it, so it doesn't help or it doesn't hurt.
No, that makes things pretty good on your end.
Yeah. So I guess moving along here, we wanted to talk about mulliganing and taking your first turn, and generally how we do these things. And we're not saying that they're necessarily right or anything like that, but this is just our mindset on it. So um, I guess I guess for you, Ryan, like what do you normally do? What do you normally do when you start a game and you kind of draw your hand and you look at it before you've even started playing?
Well, so when I draw my opening hand, I mean, obviously it's gonna matter if you're playing first or if you're playing second. But in general, the first thing I look at is, does this hand have a plan? Like, what's my first turn going to look like? What's my second turn going to look like? Is it clear what house I should go with first? Is it clear what house I should go with second turn? I don't worry too much past turn two when I'm evaluating whether or not to mulligan a hand. If I can see all the way to turn three pretty clearly, then I'm happy. But generally, by turn three, your opponent's done stuff, and you'll need to change whatever your initial plan was. So I'm not, like I said, not too worried about knowing my turn three options. Generally, though, turn one, turn two, you don't have a lot of interaction necessarily, which interaction is one of the things I don't prefer in my opening hand. If I'm the if I'm the second player, if I'm going second, removal kind of sucks. I don't. They're only going to have one creature on the board, maybe. They may not play any creatures. They may do something else. So if they have a creature and I have, you know, the if I have Twin Bolt Emission in my opening hand, that's awful because I'm only going to get half the value out of it, and it may not even kill their thing. It may just damage it, which is okay, but that's not, that's not a great opening hand play, especially if you don't have a lot of other things in that hand. Like if I have a bunch of creatures and then a Twin Bolt Emission, a bunch of Logos creatures that is, and a Twin Bolt Emission, and I'm going second, then maybe I keep that because I can either Twin Bolt them turn, my first turn, or I can wait until they get another creature out and then Twin Bolt both of them. But if you have a removal heavy hand, that is not a good opening hand because you are then waiting for your opponent to do things before you are allowed to play the game, and that's never good. Likewise, Ember Control kind of sucks. Heavy Ember Control in your opening hand kind of sucks because you have to wait for them to gain Ember before you can take it. Which, I don't prescribe to this idea of, okay, you're going to play a creature, I'm going to go to my first turn, and I will pass because I have Ember Control and you haven't generated Ember. Now it's your turn. You put some stuff down, you generate 2 Ember, and now it's back to my turn, and I guess I'll take one of those. And so my game plan, I'm now delayed an extra turn because I had to wait for them to do something before I could do something. And sure, maybe your Ember Control, like, you could play creatures and stuff, but if your creatures are the things that, like, if you have creatures that capture Ember when they come into play, it kind of feels like a waste. And this isn't hard and fast every time this comes up. This is what you should do. But it's tricky. Like if you the Raiding Knight, that's a Sanctum card. It's a 4 power, 2 armor. When it comes into play, capture Ember, and you, if that's your turn one play, it kind of feels bad because you're just getting a vanilla, 4 power, 2 armor. But that's not the worst thing you can do on turn 1. Likewise, if you're going second and you play him and you can't capture any Ember, it still kind of feels like a little bit of a waste. I mean, you can do it, but I think I would rather mulligan a hand if he's, let's say, I'm very drawn to playing Sanctum on turn 1 and he's the only creature. I'm very drawn to mulligan that hand. I'd like to see more cards and maybe get a better opener. But if he's in my second, after mulliganing it, if he's in my second hand, that's not the worst thing in the world to play him on turn 1. Granted, you lose a little bit of his efficacy, but he's still a 4 power, 2 armor guy that can reap if there's nothing worth fighting. That's kind of where I look at as far as mulligans.
Yeah, and I guess one thing to note here too is that you can only actually mulligan once. That's just something to kind of keep in mind when you're mulliganing, is because you might have a decent-ish hand, but if you're not looking at something that I think a lot of people do try to fish for that perfect hand for themselves, and unfortunately, I'm just not that lucky. So I tend to keep more hands than I throw away, because generally what ends up happening for me, and granted this is just my experience, is I know what cards are in this deck. I know kind of the things that I want, turn 1. Well, at least going second. Like, this is just purely in the sense of going second. Like, I know what things I want, how I want my hand to look. So if my hand kind of looks like that, I'm not gonna throw it away, because my chances are I'm gonna mulligan, I'm gonna draw 5 cards, and then I'm gonna be like, well, now I have 2 in one house, 1 in another house, and 1 in another house, and I'm just not gonna have a hand that's gonna feel like it's gonna be very, very efficient. So I generally try to avoid, if like kind of the same ideas that you're saying here. If I have removal or amber control in my hand, I will probably pitch that.
Right, and some good examples. So if you have like Twin Bolt Emission, that's fine to keep because it's going to be relevant sooner rather than later. I think the big thing to consider is, like, are the cards in your hand conducive to having turn 1 and turn 2 impactful? Like, if you have Miasma in your opening hand, that's a dead card. Actually, one of the things I do physically as I sit there and I'm trying to learn and get better at mulliganing. So I guess a big caveat on this whole thing is that we're not pro players. We're not great at mulliganing. So take all of this with a grain of salt in your own play experiences and your own knowledge. But as I'm learning to get better at mulliganing, what I'll do is I'll look at my hand and I will physically take cards that will be irrelevant for the first several turns and set them aside and see what cards I'm left with. So Miasma, Too Much to Protect, Bait and Switch, these kinds of cards, I take them and I set them aside and say, okay, what am I left with after I get rid of these cards that are going to be useless? Key to Dis. Actually, that one's probably worth keeping because you put that on the board right off the bat, and then it kind of forces them to play around it. It can slow their tempo. But regardless,
if I was going first and I had a Dis hand, like a Dis heavy hand, and Key to Dis was one of those cards, that's my absolute first play is Key to Dis, pass turn.
Yeah. And so my step 1 is separate the cards a little bit like that. Then with the cards that I have left, the playables, what do I have? Is there a house, like, are all of them shadow? Okay, well, if all of my playable cards are shadow, like, let's say I have a Bad Penny, a Seeker Needle, and a Silvertooth. That's a great opening hand. Even if my other 3 cards are another faction, or I have a Bait and Switch, or I have a Miasma, I'll honestly just cycle the Miasma on turn 1. It's going to be a little while before they generate a key, hopefully, fingers crossed. And I'll just cycle that for the extra Ember and play the rest of the cards out and then draw back up. But if I don't have a clear house, or let's say I have 2 Sanctum, 2 Logos, and 2 Shadow cards, and there's like 1 creature in one of the houses, and then a bunch of removal and a bunch of Miasma type effects and stuff that's more relevant in a late game than an early game, I'm going to ditch that hand. It's just not worth keeping. Ideally, I would like to see a house. I would like to see a hand that has 2 houses, maybe 1 card from the 3rd house. I could understand, but the rest of it's just 2 separate houses, and a very clear indication of, I'm going to do this on turn 1, and then I can declare that house again on turn 2. Ideally, in a perfect world, I can declare that house again on turn 2 and do more things. Or I have relevant things to do instead of declaring that house. Like, I don't want to keep a hand that can't operate without new cards. I guess is a good way to look at it. If for some reason I can't draw any cards on my next turn, I want
Right.
my hand to be playable across 2 turns. A good example of what I look for what I want my turn 1 plays to be. Going first versus going second is obviously important. But when I'm going first, I want to keep a hand where I can play a card and then be able to use that same house the following turn. That's my goal. I play my Sanctum creature. He comes in obviously exhausted. I ready him, and then it comes back to me, and I have more Sanctum cards so that I can benefit from my turn 1 play while still doing more things. If you play a Sanctum creature on your first turn as the first player, and then it comes back around to you for turn 2, and you have to go with a different house other than Sanctum, feels bad, because now you've got this guy on the board. He's not going to do anything. I mean, it's not the end of the world. It probably won't cost you the game, but it's just not as efficient as I want my first turn to be. So that's what I look for when I'm mulliganing and everything.
Going first on turn 1, that seems to be the trickiest part of really just the beginning of the game for me, because oftentimes I will play something. I will either play something that can be effective on its own, or play something that I can kind of set up for turn 3 or 4.
Mm-hmm.
So if I have a hand that's like 4 Brobnar cards, and then maybe like a discard and a shadows card, and let's just say for instance, that discard is key to dis. I'll generally turn 1, play key to dis, and then play Brobnar the next turn.
Yeah, that's a great,
just to set up what's going to, because then I can. Well, first off, key to dis is probably a bad example because it has Omni, so I mean you can use it on that Brobnar turn.
It's not a bad example though, because that's a great example of, even it's kind of like it's an Omni house. So you're choosing a play that will potentially reward you on your next turn, which is exactly what you should be doing. I mean, whether or not you use it on your next turn, it's available. You didn't waste your turn playing it,
Yeah. I mean, we can just both agree right now that Mac the Knife is the best turn 1 play, right?
Oh my god. Mac the Knife turn 1. Choose Shadows, Mac the Knife, Bad Penny, Secret Needle. That's a great turn 1. Well, no, you can't do that turn 1, but you know what I mean.
No, but yeah, it's like you play a card that can be used in any house, whatever you choose next turn. Like that's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, that's huge.
So how about going second,
Well,
like on that first turn?
So going second is tricky because you have to decide whether or not you're going to keep your hand before you see anything happen. But there's this temptation to be responsive to whatever their turn 1 play is. There's this temptation to be like gotcha. Like you played a creature and I had a removal spell and knocked out your turn 1 play. So I just basically skipped your turn. And now you have to completely reevaluate what your next turn is going to be because you don't have that creature on the table anymore. Or you played a card and gained an ember and I stole it. So I completely undid all the work that you did on your first turn. It's really tempted to be like a gotcha in that regard. But at the same time, if you keep a hand that lets you do that kind of gotcha move, and then they don't generate an ember, or they weirdly don't play a creature, then you're stuck with a handful of responses that don't do anything. So you kind of, in a way, skip your own turn. It's really interesting too. So they going first. If I'm going first, I'm going to expect that on the other player's first turn, they're going to be able to generate Ember. They're going to be able to put creatures into play because they're going to have more cards at their disposal to put on the table. So I'm incentivized to keep removal for my second turn, the third turn of the game, and Ember control to kind of blank their first turn. Even though they're trying to blank mine, so that I can steal whatever Ember they manage to get. I can kill whatever creatures they put on and really slow their tempo down. So when you're going second, knowing that the first player is thinking along those terms, is it worthwhile to blank their Ember control? Maybe don't generate, even if you can, don't generate Ember on your first turn. That way they can't steal it from you. They can't capture it. They can't interact with it. And it may be dead, make some of their cards unplayable and wastes some of their mulliganing decision. Likewise, maybe you don't play any creatures on your on your first turn. Although, as I keep saying, people not playing creatures, it seems more and more ridiculous to me, because that's the most efficient way to generate Ember. But it's possible if you suspect it, looking at your opponent's Archon card before the game, if you see they have a ton of Ember, a ton of removal, and you maybe don't have a hand with a creatures that matter so much on your first turn, there's potentially some strategic opportunity in not playing creatures, and then they have a dead hand. But you only want to do that in situations where you can benefit from it, where you can recover from it. You don't want to just skip your turn to blank some of their cards. You want to take your turn in a way that eliminates their removal cards, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to deciding what your hand's going to be like that, you have to make that decision in a vacuum, obviously. But when it comes to what you're going to do on your second turn, I actually do tend to play more reactionary to what my opponent does, and really what I mean by that is, like, I keep an eye out for what that first turn card is, right? So if I have a hand that has kind of multiple answers, because I have the luxury of having multiple decisions to kind of go with on my second turn, or on my first turn going second, I look at, okay, what's on the table right now, or what card did they just play? If they played Virtuous Works, stealing one Ember is not a terrible idea, especially if it's if it's on a stick. Like if you're talking like if I have honestly the best example is like if you have Charette in your hand and you play Charette turn 1 and you steal that 3 Amber from that Glorious Works. Like, I mean, granted, there's a lot of Magic Christmas Land going on here with that, but being able to like, I mean, putting down a 4-power creature that steals 3 Amber, like that makes them invest more into trying to have that Glorious Works pay out for them than than if you didn't have that in your hand. I mean, I guess, like, again, Magic Christmas Land, but if they do that, or if they play a bomb creature, like if they play Mushroom Man turn 1 and I have a Fear in my hand, I'm gonna play, and and my Dis is supporting that enough. I'm gonna play that Fear. I'm not gonna throw the Fear back, because that Mushroom, now they have to do, well, do I go Untamed again and just replay the Mushroom Man, or do I, am I, me going to another house gonna change that? And now I can set up for the next time that Mushroom Man comes out. So now that Mushroom Man is not unchecked when he comes into play, I actually now have answers for that.
I mean, I think a great turn 1 play is something that forces your opponent to potentially change their plan. So Mushroom Man is a great example. You slap a Mushroom Man down. So Mushroom Man is an untamed creature. I don't remember, what's his base power?
2.
Base power 2. He has 0 armor, and he gets +3 power for each unforged key you control. So if you get him down with no keys forged, he gets +9 power and is an 11, which is ridiculous. So
yeah,
he's a good example of an early game turn 1, turn 2 play that your opponent sees that hit the board, and they have to completely reevaluate what they're doing, because if they put a creature down, you can kill it. I don't think there's anything in the game that can't be one shot by a fully powered Mushroom Man, except maybe another Mushroom Man with stuff. But I think in a vacuum,
Dragon is a power 12. Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't have a turn 1 play
Leafy Dragon. Yeah, that's true.
Because so I guess 7 Amber to play it, but
yeah. So without it's in a vacuum, I think Mushroom Man is probably the most powerful card that you can play in the early game without Ember, without Unforged Key, or with Unforged Keys, and that really warps the game around it. So it's a good example. Or another one is Mace's Asp. It's a Shadows creature that has Skirmish, Poison. I think it's power 3, I want to say.
Yeah.
So that's another one. Like if I drop a Mace's Asp, now it can just kill anything on the opponent's side. They have to be really careful how they're playing their creatures and where they're playing them, and it really dictates their decision making. So these are the kinds of plays that you want to look for as a great turn 1 play.
So I have a question for you,
mm-hmm.
And it was something I just thought of. What is a good turn 1 first player play that you wouldn't call the same house next turn?
That I wouldn't call the same house next turn. Shadow Self is really good because you play that.
That was my same exact thought.
Stole it. So you play your Shadow Self. So just for anyone that's not familiar, it's a 9 power creature, shadow creature that can't do any damage when it's fighting, either receiving a fight or trying to fight. I guess you can't even fight.
It just
with
doesn't deal damage when it fights or
yeah,
is when it fights or is attacked.
Right. So, but what it can do is that whatever creatures are neighboring it, any damage they take instead dealt to the Shadow Self. So by playing that on turn 1, even if you don't declare Shadow on your next turn, you can then safely play creatures on either of its flanks, and they're going to be a lot more survivable than they would have been otherwise. And now your opponent can't really interact with your turn 2 plays because they have to get through that Shadow Self first. I'm barring a removal spell. But with creatures on the board, they have to really, it drastically warps their play decisions. Another one is Bulwark. It's a Sanctum creature, 4 power, 2 armor, and similar to Shadow Self, its neighbors get 2 armor. So that's another one that they're like, oh man, I have to get through this 4/2 armor thing. Otherwise, I have to deal with 2 armor to whoever's on its sides. The upside of Bulwark is that it actually does do damage when it fights. At the expense of not having as much protection for its side guys. So these are good examples of turn 1 plays. I can't think of a good turn 1 play that isn't a creature. Mesa Asp, I mentioned that already. The Skirmish Poisoner is a good turn 1 play because that means they either have to kill it that turn, or they know that it's going to just come in and kill whatever they play. I guess that's a bad example from what you were asking. Sorry, because you'd want to, if you play Mesa Asp turn 1, you want to be able to declare shadows the next.
Yeah.
Right. To be able to use the Mesa Asp. Not necessarily, because maybe I think that one's probably 50-50, because if you play your Asp and they take their turn and they don't play any dangerous creatures, any creatures that you're really concerned with, because they are scared of the Asp and they need to wait until they can remove it, then on your following turn, you don't have to declare shadows because there's nothing necessarily worth removing.
Right.
So, you could just remove some random creature that they played. You could reap with it, but you could also further your game plan. Maybe you have a Bulwark in your hand and you just didn't want that turn 1. You wanted to kind of bait out removal with your Mesa Asp, because the Bulwark is also a really powerful, valuable card. So you play Bulwark, and maybe you had a couple other Sanctum cards. Maybe Mesa Asp was your only shadow card. So you play that your turn 1, scare them off on their turn, and then it comes back to you, and you dump a handful of Sanctum cards alongside that Mesa Asp, and now they've got a Mesa Asp with 2 armor on top of poison that they have to deal with.
Yeah.
So there's arguments for even playing a turn 1 play where you might want to play it, or you could play it you could use it turn 2, but don't because of the contents of your hand. It's all just goes to how interesting and strategic the game is, even on the first couple turns.
Yeah.
I think that one of my metrics for a good play at any point in the game is that I want to net 2 Ember. So something like a Mesa Asp is good because I can reap with it. So in my mind, a creature is already net 1 Ember because you can always reap with it, hopefully at least once. And Mesa Asp is even better because it can safely kill an opposing creature, which means I'm taking away their ability to reap 1. So that's a net 2. You know what I mean? Since the Mesa Asp can reap itself and then can also eliminate their reaping ability at some point. That's kind of a net 2 play right there. And granted, if it goes unanswered, it can reap more, it can kill more things, but I kind of look at it as like I any given creature, I'm only... My fingers are crossed to get 1 turn with it activated, just because you bounce around different houses and everything else. Twin Bolt Emission is a great example of a potentially net 3 because it generates Ember itself, and then you could potentially take out 2 of your opponent's creatures, and that deprives them of 2 reaping opportunities. So that's net 3. So that's kind of my metric when I'm evaluating plays. I'm happy if I can net a 2 ember swing with that metric. If I only get 1 ember out of it, like cycling a miasma on turn 2 because I just want to get it out of my hand, I'm not as happy, but at least I got ember out of it. And obviously, if I get no ember out of an interaction, then I'm not very happy at all.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I was thinking about too, in the sense, is using a card like Titan Mechanics. So Titan Mechanics, one of those cards for me that I find is very interesting, just because what it does. So I believe it is a 5 or 6 power creature. When it comes into play, keys cost -1. I actually think it's 6 power. So it's a big.
So it is 6 power.
It is a big thing to drop on the table turn 1, and it definitely sets the pace for the rest of the game, or at least the rest of the time that creature exists. But getting a hand where you can potentially on turn 2 draw a ton of or generate a ton of amber, and then having like something like Key Charge in your hand, I find that would be a really interesting like turn 1 play. I'm not sure, again, a lot of circumstances there to pull it off, but I think I'd love to see that happen sometime.
Yeah. Well, and Titan is a really interesting turn 1, turn 2 play. Like, is it good? Is it bad? Granted, it lowers the key count for your opponent, but in the early game, it's going to be unlikely that they have 5 ember, but when you pass back to them. So they're not immediately going to be able to benefit from it. And like, let's say it's turn 1, right? And you play Titan Mechanic. Obviously, it's on a flank, so all keys are now 5 instead of 6. You pass back to your opponent for their first turn. Now, they have to decide, do I just try to go whole hog with my hand and make as much ember as possible and let the Titan live? That way I can benefit from this discounted key, or do I fear this 6 power creature? Because if the Titan player is not that worried about gaining the benefit from the Titan as far as the -1 ember, then are they just going to slam it face first into whatever I play and wreck my board? Plus, I don't know what they have in their hand. If they have 2 more creatures in their hand on their next turn, suddenly I've spent my entire turn trying to generate Ember to benefit from a Titan that is no longer relevant.
Right.
Now the Titan's just a 6 power beat stick because there's a creature on either side of it. Or do they have a bonkers turn and they're going to steal my Ember, get themselves up to 5, keep the Titan on a flank, and now I'm behind and they've got an extra key, like, super fast. So it's a really, really interesting turn 1 play, early gameplay, even not even a turn 1, but even turn 1. Like, that's a scary concept. There's a lot of decision making involved as far as how you want to handle an opposing Titan. That makes it really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm like looking at the card list here, and it is the most powerful. It is the most powerful creature in Logos. So I'm wondering if that -1 amber cost is intended to be a negative for the card. To kind of,
well, yeah, because you pass it. So the Titan is kind of bad late game, and that's why, not bad late game, but that -1 ember ability is a detriment late game, and it's inconsequential early game. And when I say late game, I mean, like, it's not really late game, mid to late game, like turns 4 or 5 onward, when you can actually benefit from that discounted key. Because you play the Titan, your opponent might already have 5 ember, and you're just handing them a key.
Right.
So and that's only going to happen mid to late game. So, but you get a 6 power creature in Logos, which is, so I think it's supposed to be a trade-off of, the discount versus the power. But if you can make it work in your favor, or if you get it early game and then drop stuff next to it, that's a 6 power creature with no drawback. Or if you have a deck that really does a good job controlling your opponent's Ember, then they're at 0 most of the game, and hey, guess what? All my keys are cheap.
Right. So do you track your wins and losses?
I have. So I know you started tracking yours pretty early on. I did not so much. I think I started right around the time when we decided to start doing this podcast. Our first Tuesday that we went out to play at a store was the first time I started tracking. And I think I've done pretty accurate tracking since then. I haven't played on Crucible that much. I just haven't gotten around to it. I know we played a little bit initially. So my tracking isn't as robust as yours. I think I've got one deck that's played 4 games or 5 games. I think that's the most that any of my decks have played. Yeah, because I think it's 4-1. But I like the concept of tracking my wins and losses.
So I guess the accompanying question is, do you feel there's value in doing it?
Is there value? I don't know. I guess it depends on why you're doing it. I mean, I just think it's kind of neat to track the wins and losses. I don't know if I'm necessarily going to gain anything out of it. I think I would have to play a statistically significant amount of games with all of my decks. And this is just my personal feeling on it, but I think that if, like, let's say I have 2 decks and I play those decks all the time, and I've been tracking all the wins and losses for those decks, and let's say I'm around 50% win rate on those. Well, that doesn't necessarily tell me a lot, because it doesn't tell me if I'm getting better as a player, because for all I know, I was 0-10 and then won 10 in a row, but there's no timeline on when your wins are tracked. So it doesn't really show me that I've been improving. It also doesn't really give me a basis of comparison, because I'm not playing anything other than those 2 decks. So if I were playing all of my decks a statistically significant amount of times, and I was able to track it over a timeline, that's when I would get valuable data, as, you know, more of a competitive minded player. That having been said, I'm still totally going to track them, and I think it's really fun. So I'm going to do it because it's fun, even if it's no benefit.
Yeah, I've been doing it mostly just to get an idea of what decks aren't fitting my playstyle and what I can do to change that, and like look at those cards a little bit more in depth. Mostly because I have
Okay.
quite a few like 0-4 decks, and I look at them and I don't feel like they're bad, and they do have a lot of synergies. It's just like this question of what am I doing wrong with, with these plays that are making it so it can't win. So that's mostly what I've been kind of peeking at, is like, what can I learn from the tracking that I do have, or why a deck's going 50-50. Like, is there a misplay that I'm just not seeing here that's causing me to lose more games, or
Yeah, I
something
mean,
like that?
yeah. Are you playing the cards wrong? Are you playing the deck wrong? Is there something about it? Or is it just a bad deck? I mean, it gives you, I guess, if you don't know how well you're doing with a deck, numerically speaking, then it's really hard to tell if that's you or the deck. Like, you don't even know to look. Like, if you're not tracking any of your wins and losses, then you'd be like, I think I've been winning a lot with this deck, or I think I've been losing a lot with this deck. But you're going to be biased by whatever your most recent experiences are. So maybe you feel like you've been losing with this deck, but in reality you've won 15 games with it and only lost 5, and it's just that the last 3 games you've played with it you've lost, and that's just, dumb luck. So it's I guess it's probably pretty, if you want to improve with a particular deck, it's probably beneficial to track your wins and losses regardless of all the fancy stuff I was talking about earlier about timelines and
Right.
everything else. But I guess a good question too is, so you track a lot more, you play more on Crucible than I do, you track a lot more than I do, period, just numerically. What games are there any games that you don't count? Are there any games where you're like, I'm not going to count that one, that wasn't really a good example? Like, is there a certain criteria you use to decide at all if a game shouldn't count?
I've been tracking. At first, I was tracking everything, regardless if I was piloting the deck or not. I've kind of backed off of that. I mostly track any time that the deck gets put on the table with my hand, by my hand. So,
Okay.
and
With
yeah,
you as pilot.
and like
I see. No.
the thing that I actually did think about too, in a couple of situations, and really it comes down to the Crucible and the nature of it. when I do play on the Crucible is, do I count disconnect wins, or do I count disconnects as wins, or do I count certain events that happen in the Crucible?
Like a misclick, or if there's probably not any
No,
bugs, but if someone misclicks
I
or something
attribute
happens.
misclicks to misplays in a lot of ways. Like,
Okay.
so if someone, I mean, again, like I'll bring it up uh for the third time I think on this podcast, like that time that I played Key Abduction, like I could be like, oh well, that was, I mean, I guess it technically wasn't a misclick, but like if I mischoose a house, um like that's, I attributed that to the same as me just saying out loud, like, oh, I choose this house and whatever. um what I do track if someone concedes, which I I mean that just makes sense. But a lot of times, like, it really, the quality of player really depends on what you get in the Crucible. Sometimes someone just concedes with no explanation, and generally those
I
I do
guess
track
that
just because it's like a moment of like, well, you either saw something and you didn't want to say anything in chat, or you you just didn't want to say anything to me, but you had to leave. But I still count that as a win for myself because we
I
played
don't know.
through
I
that
guess
game. You know what I mean?
I guess it depends when they're
That's true.
conceding. Like if the game has gone on for a while and you're at 2 keys and they are at, it doesn't matter how many keys they're at. But if the game is played a good amount of time and they concede, I definitely agree that I'd call that a win, unless they say like, oh hey, I have to run to dinner. But even then, I would try to do my best to evaluate the board and say, am I, like, do I have a better than even chance that I would have won this game? I mean, obviously you have no idea what they're going to draw, what you're going to draw and everything, but just the board as is. Like, let's say, actually one of the interesting things we looked over was the tiebreakers in the tournament rules. And how those are tracked. You could even use that as your concession. Like if it's an out of the blue concession or a disconnect, you could use the tiebreaker to figure out if it was a win or loss. So that's
Yeah.
kind of an interesting thing. If you're playing against a new player, like not obviously if you're teaching someone the game, I assume you wouldn't count that win or loss. But if it's someone that's like, oh, I just got this deck, I've only played like 2 games, and then you play against that person, would you count that win or loss? Like if you lost, if
Oh
you
yeah,
lost to them, would
absolutely.
you count that? If
I
you
would
won
count it
against them, would you
regardless.
count it? Well, you
Yeah.
count the win as well.
I
Interesting.
mean, it's still one, right? Like in that sense, if we played through the entire game, like regardless of your experience level, like that criteria doesn't. I don't think that criteria plays for me.
So the caliber of opponent doesn't dictate whether or not you track it. So like if you go up against someone that maybe has never even played a card game before and you just blow them out of the water, or obviously they played a card, so like this is their second time playing Keyforge, but they've never played anything before it and they're obviously just not a very skilled player and you just annihilate them, you would count that
Yeah,
win.
I mean, think about it this way too. If that was a new tournament setting for somebody and they just decided to jump in on a sealed, and even if you didn't know, uh, you didn't know that deck, but you sit down across from this person, they're like, yeah, this is my first time playing Keyforge. I learned 15 minutes ago. That win still counts in the tournament setting.
Yeah,
Like
that's
it,
fair.
like
That's
their
fair.
experience doesn't matter. Like, and it's not like I'm counting that win to rub it in their face or whatever. It's just like, did I win with this
No,
deck? Yes. Okay. I'm gonna add it to my tracking.
but I guess if you're, I think I guess it loops back to the original purpose of why are you tracking the wins? Like if you're tracking the wins to try and get an idea of how good you are with that deck, raffle stomping someone who's never played before, while valid in a tournament, is not necessarily a valid indication of you being skilled with the deck so much as them being unskilled at the game. Like if you just flipped over and played random cards, would you have
I
won?
mean, that's fair.
Like it's not. So I mean, and again, I'm not
Oh no.
critiquing you for counting or hypothetically counting that, but it's an interesting like, do you or don't you? Because at the same token, if you were to play against that same person and lose, like, and this is, I'm kind of laughing at myself because I feel like if I won against a person like that, I would be reticent to track it. Because it kind of feels like an unfair win. Like I was probably like 90% to win that game, just
Right.
skill and deck quality maybe. But if I lost against that person, if that other 10% happened and I lost to them, I would be much less reticent to count it. I would be like, oh yeah, I lost to a new person. I mean that counts. But then I don't think of the other side of it. Like, well, if I won against that person, would I count it? And it should be equal either way. If you wouldn't count it when you win, you shouldn't count it when you lose, and vice versa. So yeah, interesting. So count your games, folks. It doesn't take much time, and it will probably help you in the long run more than it will
I think
hinder
with
you.
with the chain bound stuff that's come out and how that stuff's going to get tracked there, I think that's going to, I mean, your wins and losses are going to get tracked anyway. So.
Oh, we didn't say that at the beginning of this topic, but that's important to know. This is not related to chain bound. This is just in the app. Yeah. You can go in and manually put in your wins and losses, just for personal, satisfaction. That's what we're talking about this whole time. Probably should have put that at the beginning.
Like, I mean, you don't have a chance to not. Yeah,
if you made it this far,
you don't have a chance to not log your losses in an actual event.
I just didn't want to confuse anyone that was like, I didn't realize you could put in your own wins and losses for chain bound. Like, nope, that's not what we're talking about.
So
like, no wonder there's undefeated people.
Yeah, that's fair.
You're like, oh yeah, I don't know what the problem is. I'm like 24 chains on my deck because I just pumped up a bunch of wins.
No, it's easy.
What do you mean I have to prove it?
Yeah. So I think that about does it for us today. Do you have anything that you want to you plug there, Ryan?
No, not really. We I think we can just mention our social media stuff. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, and we're at email. For Twitter and email, we are Keychains Pod. For Twitter, it's at, obviously, and for email, it's keychainspod at gmail.com. And for Facebook, I assume it's Keychains Pod. Two separate words. Keychains
it's
Pod,
all
right?
the same. I mean, if you're just searching for it, it's two separate words, but if you want to search just like at Keychains Pod, that will work as well.
Gotcha. So I didn't realize that was a Facebook thing.
Yeah,
learn something new every
copying everybody.
Yeah, like that Twitter thing. Yeah, just that's Facebook. So anyway, I think it's gonna.
All right, man. Well, have a good one.
Yeah, you too. Thanks everyone for listening, and join us again next week.
Bye.